Aloha mai. Good evening to everyone joining us tonight. I'm John Nouchi, Deputy Director of the city's Department of Transportation Services. And so tonight we'll get to see some reimagination of, I guess depending where you are, our gateway to Makiki or our gateway to Ala Moana, our very important Makai running Keʻeaumoku Street. So as required by city ordinance, we will look at ways to balance out this essential roadway with an eye towards complete streets for all users, from pedestrians to bikes to cars, trucks, and buses, with an eye on the present and future uses. We've already started to see an evolution of Keʻeaumoku over the past few years. And, thinking back, I still remember, having Chicken Alice and Shakey's Pizza there from before time. But, with an eye on what can be in the future, I'll turn it over to our DTS team to just dive right into it tonight. And so mahalo for coming online with us. We know everybody's time right now is very precious.
Thank you, John, very much. Good evening. My name is Renee Espio. I'm the Complete Streets Administrator for City and County. I have the fun but sometimes tough job of helping people reimagine streets and public space so they can work better. John had alluded to our Complete Streets law at the City and County. So about 9 years ago or so, the City Council actually required all city departments to be more proactive in considering everyone who uses our city streets every time we touch the street, right? So as everybody knows, we sort of have routine roadway paving and rehabilitation that we do every 10 years or so to improve the pavement, and that is a perfect time for us to implement changes on the streets. Very efficient, and there's already construction activities. We kind of do everything at once. So that's our plan here tonight, is to talk about complete streets changes for Keʻeaumoku that we intend to implement as part of an upcoming roadway paving project. It's still several years away, so we have the luxury of time right now to basically explore different options, talk about trade-offs, and really see, what changes would serve the community best. So, this is just a short summary of kind of why we do that. But the bottom line is it is the law of the land, and of course, it's the right thing to do. Fine. So a brief agenda for tonight's meeting. We are going to introduce the Keʻeaumoku Complete Streets project, talk a little bit about the area, some existing conditions, including some safety challenges that are ongoing in the corridor. We'll summarize the community outreach that we've done so far, and then we will discuss some different design tools that we have, in our toolkit to improve the safety for everyone out there on the roadway. And then we will get into some design options for how we can apply those different tools to this corridor. And then we're going to have two different breakout sessions. So we have kind of the main session here where everybody's together. If you have comments or questions, throw them in the chat. But we will have smaller group breakout sessions to cover different portions of the corridor where you will actually get to ask questions and provide comments kind of in a more personable kind of one-on group setting there, and we'll take down your comments and make sure we incorporate those as we move towards coming up with a draft plan. And then we'll just come back together to talk about next steps and send everybody on their merry way.
Hi, Renee. Actually, can I hop in right now? And I just wanted to recognize and shout out to our esteemed council member of the district, Councilmember Calvin Say, who's joining us tonight. He's always really been a great ally for transportation and, just really helping move the city forward in terms of innovative transportation concepts and ideas. So I wanted to make sure that everyone recognized that he was here participating in the meeting.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Thank you, council member, for joining us and always being supportive of our efforts to make our streets safer. Okay, let's jump to some introductions. On our side, we have several departments actually collaborating on this project. We've got our project manager, Franz, who is in the Department of Planning and Permitting. Hi, Franz, and he keeps us all on track and keeps us moving. I am under John in the Department of Transportation Services and joined by Dana Alexander there, who also runs a number of these other projects across the island. And then we have our Department of Design and Construction joining us tonight too. They will take over the project after planning and help us do construction documents and then actually manage the paving project and the improvements. We are very, very fortunate to be assisted by a fabulous team of consultants that represent a broad spectrum of expertise, as well as geographical expertise. So we have HHF planners, they are locally based. They are kind of overseeing the process and on the private side. We've got Austin Tsutsumi and Associates, a number of folks there, including Claire and Kristen, who are really helping us with the traffic modeling and trying to make sure that any changes that we make, you know, we try to keep traffic flowing pretty well, as well as just some design ideas. And then Tool Design Group is led by Adrian Whitty on this team, is based on the continent, and they bring to us sort of the best practices in terms of complete streets design. So wonderful team, and they are all here tonight. If you see anybody with the background behind them, they are on our project team. Please feel free in the breakout groups to chat them up and ask questions and share all of your thoughts. So I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Erin at HHF Planners, and she will give us a little bit on logistics and etiquette, and then pass it on to John, our project manager at HHF.
Hi, all. Thank you again for joining. Just a quick housekeeping note. The meeting is recorded, so it's being recorded. I think you probably all had that message when you came in. You are muted upon entry, and we're just asking that if you have any comments while we're in the main room, that you use the chat feature, and feel free to do that at any time. We have somebody that's going to be monitoring that so they can quickly get back to you. And just because it has to be said, everyone be nice, no impersonating or mocking people or institutions, no false statements or bad language. And I am the bouncer. This is probably the only kind of bouncer gig I would ever be able to get. But anyway, yes, everyone be on, just be nice. And so how to mute and unmute, just very quickly, it's at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you have the red bar across, it means you are muted or your video is off. And if you don't have the red bar, you're on. How to chat. So it's going to be just below the screen, the little bubble that says chat. So you just click on that, you type your question or comment in, and make sure you hit enter, and then it'll go to the chat room. And then how to use Zoom polling. So we're going to actually do a little practice exercise, but just, choose your response. It'll just be a bubble. You're going to click to submit, and then you can always add any additional thoughts in the chat. Okay, so we're going to do just a really quick live polling warm up. Let me just get that up really quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to launch this, and everybody can just make their selections. How do you typically get around on Keʻeaumoku Street? I'm just going to keep it up really briefly. Maybe like 10 more seconds. I see a comment in the chat, push stroller. I'm there too. All right. So we got, let's see. So I should be sharing the results now. So I think most of you did take part. And I think you all know how to poll.
Thanks, Erin. I wanted to also recognize, I know Ryan Tam, the neighborhood board chair for Kaka'ako, is here. So thanks, Ryan, for joining us, and Ian Ross as well with Makiki Neighborhood Board. So thank you guys for your time and your leadership in joining us. So I think at that point, I'm going to turn it over to John Hagihara with HHS, who's going to walk us through the project and what we have to discuss this evening.
Great. Thanks, Renee. Aloha, everyone. My name is John Hagihara. I'm the project manager with HHF Planners. And like Renee said, I'll be running through some of the project details and kind of getting into some of the proposed improvements and the design concepts tonight. So just some quick background. I think Renee's covered most of this, but Keʻeaumoku is been identified for rehabilitation and resurfacing from Kapiolani to Wilder. So that's kind of the extent of our project. And like she said, you know, these improvements aren't likely to take place until 2024 or later. So we're kind of using this time now to look at how we might improve the design when it does go up for resurfacing and rehabilitation. So just in terms of where we're at kind of in the project right now, we started earlier this year with kind of some preliminary data collection and getting out and just trying to get a better understanding of the corridor and really getting out and doing some initial community outreach that we'll cover later. We also held a series of stakeholder events and charrettes actually to try to get an idea of some design improvements that we could make along the corridor. And that really led to these preliminary designs that we'll be showing you today and getting your feedback on. So tonight is the first community meeting. After this, we'll take your input and go back and refine the concepts. Once we've kind of identified the preferred design, we'll come back, have another community meeting, get your input again, and then the project, following that meeting, the project will move towards more detailed design. So just in general, for this area, you know, we wanted to provide a little bit of background on kind of the context for the project. And so Keʻeaumoku Street and complete streets in general, in addition to the law, is really enshrined in you know, a number of planning and policy documents. So the general plan and the primary urban core development plan, as well as the Ala Moana neighborhood TOD plan, all you know, emphasize the need for a safe and balanced multimodal transportation system. Additionally, the Oahu bike plan. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you try to speak up a little bit or speak closer to your mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep. So the Oahu bike plan has identified a protected bike lane along this portion of Keʻeaumoku Street and as a priority 1 facility. So it's a really critical part of the low stress bicycle network in the urban core. And then the Oahu pedestrian plan has identified Keʻeaumoku as a high pedestrian injury corridor and also has called for it to be part of the priority network to make safety improvements, to prioritize those safety improvements. And when we look at the neighborhood surrounding the Keʻeaumoku corridor, there's some really kind of interesting characteristics that just emphasize the need for these complete streets improvements. So one, want to call your attention to is just, you know, the senior population in this area is significantly higher than the average population across the island of Oahu. And we know that seniors can be more vulnerable on our roadways. So it's really, you know, brings home the need to make these improvements and protect them. And also just the number of households here that have 1 or fewer vehicles is almost 3 times the average across the entire island of Oahu. So we know that folks are walking and biking and that we need to make it, and taking transit, that we need to make it more safe and comfortable. And that's really just driven home in the commuting data for the Keʻeaumoku census tracts, where we see that, you know, the rates of walking and biking and taking the bus are significantly higher than the rates of Oahu in general. And so again, just kind of drives home the need for these types of safety improvements and to make a real multimodal Keʻeaumoku Street. So as an initial task for this project, we went in and did kind of a comprehensive safety review for the corridor, looking at crash data from a variety of sources, including EMS and the Department of Health, the fatality reporting system, as well as the Honolulu Police Department. And there's some kind of key trends that I wanted to go over quickly. One is that there's a few really long blocks along Keʻeaumoku Street without safe crossings, and each of these long blocks was identified as kind of a high incident rate for especially pedestrian-related crashes. And so we know that there's a demand to cross Keʻeaumoku, and when there's not a safe option, people are still doing so and getting into trouble and having crashes. Also, there's a significant issue with vehicles not yielding to pedestrians and bikes. And so that's another issue that we've identified through the safety analysis that we're trying to address in some of the safety improvements that we'll go through later. And again, if we look at just the pedestrian crashes along the corridor, again, it becomes really easy to see that the mid-block crossings are a significant source of those crashes. They account for almost a third of all the crashes, pedestrian crashes along the corridor. So we'll quickly go through some of the existing and in-process conditions along the corridor, just to get a sense of what it's like for all the different modes along the corridor, whether you use all of them or use some, just to kind of get everybody on the same page. So for pedestrians, there's sidewalks along the entire corridor, but especially in the Mauka section, they can be pretty narrow. And you can see here the picture of the H1 overpass. You have a pretty narrow sidewalk, and it's directly adjacent to a vehicle travel lane. So you're really walking shoulder to shoulder with fast moving traffic. So again, the sidewalks in many cases lack that buffer from traffic. There are street trees along a large part of the corridor, but there are areas where it's unshaded and can be kind of uncomfortable to walk. So that's something that we know is a priority. And also, like I mentioned earlier, these unprotected turning movements and driveways create conflicts for pedestrians and safety issues. In terms of bicyclists, so there is no current bicycle facility along Keʻeaumoku Street. So bikes are supposed to ride with traffic. And as we know, Keʻeaumoku is a pretty high volume and can be a high-speed corridor. So it's not the most comfortable place for bicyclists to ride. So I think oftentimes you'll see bicyclists riding on the sidewalk. And obviously that creates its own conflicts with pedestrians and safety issues. That being said, we know there's a demand to ride on Keʻeaumoku Street. It connects to Beretania, Young, and King, which is kind of a major spine of the bikeway network in Honolulu. And there's 5 biki stops along the entirety of the corridor that we're working in. Looking at transit, so Keʻeaumoku is served by 4 bus routes, the number 5, number 6, number 17, and number 18, as well as the handy van. And there's 4 Makai bound stops and 3 Mauka bound stops. And one thing that we wanted to consider as part of this project is, potential future bus service expansion along the corridor. Rail potentially will be coming into, or eventually will be coming into Ala Moana Center. And even without rail, that transit center at Ala Moana is the busiest transit center on the island. So we know that kind of at one end of our project is a really significant transit location. And then in terms of traffic, we have been out in the field, doing observations as well as taking traffic counts. And we're lucky to have a lead traffic engineer that also lives in the corridor. So she's very familiar with traffic and the traffic issues along Keʻeaumoku. In general, in the AM peak hour, traffic flows generally pretty smoothly along the corridor. But in the PM, there are significant points of congestion, especially at Kapiolani, King, and Beretania. And one thing we know is that there's a lot of demand for turning movements off of Keʻeaumoku Street. And so there can be congestion issues with turning vehicles, especially left turning vehicles, blocking through traffic because they don't have a dedicated turn phase. So that's one issue that we've tried to address in our designs. As you know, if you've been to the Makai end of Keʻeaumoku lately, there are several ongoing or recently completed, as well as planned developments in that area. As you can see on the map here, the Azure development was recently completed. The Sky and the Central are in construction, and you can see those others are in the planning phase. So those projects are mixed use, mixed income, and they're going to add a lot of commercial and residential uses along the corridor. It's going to increase, obviously, the number of people and the number of destinations to the extent possible. And where those projects have frontage along Keʻeaumoku Street, the city will be is looking at the developers to make improvements to the pedestrian facilities fronting their developments. And obviously, all of those projects will add a significant amount of off-street parking in the area.
Hey, John, could you just speak up a little bit more, please?
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the on-street parking and loading, there's 46 total spaces across the entire corridor. That's separated out between 22 marked spaces in the Makai end of the corridor, so between Kapiolani and King Street. And just wanted to note that 14 of those marked spaces are fronting the development, the park development, and those spaces are slated to be removed once that development is completed. So then we'd be left with only 8 marked spaces in that Makai section of the corridor. In the Mauka end of the corridor, there's 24 unmarked spaces, mostly in the vicinity of Makiki District Park. There's also a couple loading zones, and just wanted to note that all of the on-street parking and loading are subject to peak hour restrictions currently. In terms of off-street parking, there's over 30,000 stalls kind of in the vicinity of Keʻeaumoku Street. So there's a really significant amount of off-street parking, and like we mentioned, new parking will be added with the new developments that are going in. So I think especially in the Makai end of the corridor, there's a significant amount of available parking if the on-street parking is lost. And just as a recent improvement, that's part of the existing conditions now. The city's recently installed the Barnes Dance crossing, or an all-way pedestrian crossing at Makaloa Street. It was installed just a few weeks ago, so if you haven't been out there, go out and check it out. But essentially, there's an exclusive pedestrian phase, so no cars all cars have the red light, and pedestrians are allowed to cross diagonally or parallel to the street in any direction. So this was funded and designed by the Azure developer as part of their development requirements. So those are kind of the existing conditions for the corridor. I just wanted to go through quickly some of our initial community outreach. Earlier this year, we went out along the corridor and spoke to, I think, 65 different businesses walking up and down Keʻeaumoku Street. We also posted a virtual walk audit survey to get input on what people see on a day-to-day basis along Keʻeaumoku Street, and got over 300 responses there. There's another large number of responses on the online wiki map to see where people are having issues along Keʻeaumoku. And we also held an in-person walk audit. It was only for stakeholders due to COVID restrictions, but it was a really good opportunity to get out there with stakeholders, have them walk the corridor, even if they're already familiar with it, walking the corridor and having kind of the different lenses of safety and comfort in mind and getting their input on, potential issues and possible solutions. And so after that in-person walk audit, we also did a design charrette with those stakeholders and city staff to really start to put pen on paper and try to get some design ideas on the table. And those ideas eventually kind of morphed into the concepts that we'll be presenting today. So just some common themes from our outreach. Again, turning vehicles and the failure to yield to pedestrians, we know is a critical issue for folks walking on the corridor. Again, there's some really long blocks, and there's a desire for mid-block crossings. Like I said, there's no bicycle facility on Keʻeaumoku right now, so there's really a demand to make it safer and more comfortable to bike, and add better shading and lighting for pedestrians. In the Malco portion of the corridor, it's really important to the Makiki Neighborhood Board and the community up there to improve the connection between Makiki District Park and Cartwright Park. And then again, we heard from a lot of individuals about perceived safety concerns due to homeless or houseless individuals on the corridor. So with that, wanted to get into the improvement toolbox for the corridor. So these, like Renee said, these are kind of some of the design tools that we've used to address some of the safety issues that we've just talked about. So I guess the first thing to discuss is kind of how do we find space for complete streets improvements. On the right, as you see here, is kind of an existing typical cross section for Keʻeaumoku Street. So you can see there's 6 lanes of traffic, 3 in each direction. In the Makai portion of the corridor, one of those lanes on the Diamond Head side has peak hour restricted parking, and you have 8-foot sidewalks on each side with some street trees. So the first option is potentially to expand the right-of-way, but obviously we know that Keʻeaumoku Street is very well developed, and we're really not going to be able to push the right-of-way out into private property. Like I mentioned, when there are new developments that have frontage on Keʻeaumoku, the city will be seeking to get improvements to pedestrian facilities on those frontages. But kind of as a whole, we can't expand the right-of-way. So we know that we need to work within what we have. Another option is to try and reduce lane widths. So the minimum lane width is 10 feet, and the 4 kind of interior lanes are all at that minimum width. So we're really just left with potentially 2 feet to work with in each of the outside lanes. And really the other option is to repurpose a travel lane. This is also known as a road diet, but instead of having 3 travel lanes in each direction, to look at having 2 travel lanes in each direction with a center turn lane, and provide some space so that we can add bike facilities and pedestrian improvements at intersections and mid-block. So on that, another improvement that we're looking at for the corridor, especially at those mid-block locations, is pedestrian crossing safety improvements. So this would include things like a median refuge island. This is a example from Kamakee Street. So the median refuge island really provides kind of a safe halfway point for pedestrians when they're crossing the street. And also it's coupled here with the rectangular rapid flashing beacons. And so it's activated by the pedestrian and really starts flashing once the pedestrian hits the button, and just lets the drivers know that there's a pedestrian crossing and that they need to look out and yield to the pedestrian. We've also included some curb extensions or bulb outs. So here's a couple examples from town that you'll probably recognize, but up in top of the hill on Waialae, there's some constructed curb extensions. And then on Nu'uanu Street in Chinatown is kind of painted bulb outs. But the idea is really the same, to try and reduce the crossing distance for pedestrians and allow them to kind of get out into the street and into the driver's view before they enter the crosswalk. And in addition to that, it tightens the turning radius for vehicles, forcing them to slow down when they make the turn. Like I mentioned earlier, the barn distance crossing just recently went in at Makaloa Street. You can see the picture on the left here shows the existing striping there. One potential improvement we're looking at is some striping improvements to the barn stance crossing, really to just make it more clear what is okay for pedestrians to do, to make it clear that they can cross diagonally and that that exclusive pedestrian phase is just for pedestrians. We've also included some transit islands. And so the idea here is to really bring the bus stop out to the bus rather than forcing the bus to come to the curb. It does a couple, I guess, in addition to that benefit, it also reduces conflicts between buses and the bike lane, which might be along the curb. So in this case, you'd bring the bike lane up to sidewalk level behind the transit island and provide pedestrian crossing areas where bikes would yield to pedestrians crossing to the transit island, and also provide enough space for ADA compliant boarding. We've also looked at protected only left turn phasing at a number of intersections along the corridor. Like I mentioned, we know there's an issue with turning vehicles failing to yield to pedestrians. And it's really can be difficult when vehicles are trying to turn across multiple lanes of traffic and dealing with potentially pedestrians in a crosswalk. So yeah, one design solution is to make left turns at those signalized intersections protected only. And so what that means is that there would be a left turn on the arrow only. So this exists currently at Komoku Street, which is the Walmart entrance. And it provides an exclusive phase for those left turns so they don't have to deal with the oncoming traffic and pedestrians in the crosswalk. And then once the left turn arrow turns off and there's a green light for the cars, it would also be the pedestrian walk signal, and bikes would be going with the green as well. So they would be going unopposed by that left turning movement. We've also proposed one-way protected bike lanes along Keʻeaumoku Street. This would be similar to what you've seen recently installed on Ward Avenue. So it's a directional bike lane on each side of the street, protected by a painted buffer and flexible delineators. And one design option that we've also included is bike signals at some of these intersections. As you'll see when we get into the designs, there's several locations where there's conflicts between right turning vehicles and bicyclists. So a bicyclist here that might be wanting to go through, if you install a bike signal, you would turn off the right turn, allow the bicycle and the pedestrian to cross the street unopposed by the right turn, and then turn off the bikes and pedestrians and allow the right turning vehicle to make that right turn without the conflict of the bicycles and pedestrians. And kind of an alternative to this is using bicycle conflict zone markings. This is again on Ward Avenue, and you've probably seen this a lot on King Street as well. But it allows vehicles to merge across the bike lane. So obviously you need to drop the bike lane protection, but by putting down green paint and those striped white lines, kind of identifies that this is a location where drivers should expect bicyclists and there's a potential conflict, and also reinforces the bicyclist priority in that space. And again, just wanted to reiterate that a lot of these bicycle improvements have, I guess, some kind of additional benefits of pedestrian safety. The city's found that in looking at King Street, with the implementation of the King Street bike lane here in 2015-2016, there's been a significant drop in pedestrian-related EMS attended crashes along King Street. And so, in addition to providing a safe place to bike, those protected bike lanes can also improve pedestrian safety. So you'll see all those tools in the design concepts that we'll be presenting, but just wanted to go through quickly some of the other options that we looked at, but ultimately decided to dismiss. So we did look at a barn stance at Keʻeaumoku as well as Makaloa, but essentially the traffic modeling showed us that, at least at this point, it was going to have significant operations, so we dismissed that as an option. Similarly, we looked at a 4-lane cross section between Beretania and King to provide additional space for complete streets improvements. But again, the modeling showed that it would have a significant impact on traffic, so we're not proposing that at this time. We also looked at a 2-way protected bike lane, which is similar to what you'd see on King Street, where there's bike traffic in 2 directions on one side of the street. It wouldn't be possible in the Makai portion of Keʻeaumoku because of all the driveways, but from King Street, Mauka, there really isn't that many driveways. So we did look at it as an option there, but ultimately the required signal infrastructure upgrades and the safety and kind of convenience impacts of having bicyclists go from a 1-way to a 2-way facility was kind of too difficult to overcome, so we dismissed that at this point. We also looked at expanding sidewalks over the H1 overpass to improve connections across H1, but we kind of in conversation with the stakeholders, we realized that improving the sidewalks might have the unintended consequence of encouraging bicyclists to use the sidewalks, which we know is currently a major issue along that section. And so I think as kind of a compromise, as you'll see, we're proposing bike lanes over the bridge. And I think that has added benefit of dedicating bicyclists and pedestrian space over the bridge, as well as the bike lane provides kind of an additional buffer between vehicles and pedestrians. And then finally, we looked at closing the Lunalilo Street U-turn. It's currently a fairly difficult turn to make, having to cross across 2 lanes of traffic and deal with potentially pedestrians in the crosswalk. But in our traffic counts, we found that it's really a heavily used turn. And so instead of removing it altogether, we're looking at trying to clean it up and make it a little bit safer and an easier turn to navigate. So with that, we'll get into our preliminary design concepts. Just in terms of our design principles, really, the first principle is to improve pedestrian safety and comfort by reducing conflicts. Again, we wanted to create a dedicated bike facility along the corridor, improve transit stops and allow for potential bus service expansion, increase safety and efficiency of vehicle operations, and minimize impacts to the availability of parking in the Makai Zone. So as you'll see, we've put together 2 design concepts to get your feedback on. Option A has the highest level of bicycle, pedestrian, and transit improvements. And option B is kind of a scaled back version with scaled back bicycle, pedestrian, and transit improvements, but also less impact to vehicle operations. And ultimately, we'll be getting your input on these design options as a whole, but we also want to get your thought on specific improvements in those options. Ultimately, we might be looking at more of a hybrid, taking kind of the best from each of these options and making an ultimate kind of alternative that includes kind of the best parts of each of these. So quickly, just going through a summary of the options, we're looking at 2035 as our base year for evaluating the project. So even without any roadway changes, if we just look at all the new development that's coming in and maintain the roadway as is, obviously that wouldn't address any of the pedestrian safety issues that we know are evident along the corridor, and it wouldn't provide any bike facility, and transit facilities would stay the same. So like I mentioned, in option A, it has kind of the highest level of pedestrian bike improvements. And in option B, those improvements are slightly scaled back. And we'll go through that in the design concepts. And both option A and option B are really kind of equal in terms of their transit improvements. Looking at traffic and parking in the baseline scenario, even if there's no roadway changes, there'd be approximately 30-second delay just due to the additional traffic from the new developments that are coming in, compared with in the option A, there's an additional 90 seconds of delay. And this is only during the Makai bound weekday PM peak. There'd be less additional delay during the other peak hours. And I guess also just want to note that that's for if you're traveling the entire length of the corridor. And that's compared with option B, which would have only 30 seconds of additional delay in that weekday PM and Saturday midday peak, with less delay at other times. In terms of parking, currently there's a substantial amount of off-street parking. If in option A, we would lose, in both options, we would lose the 8 stalls in the Makai end of the corridor. And there's just a slight difference in the number of unmarked stalls that we lose in the Mauka end of the corridor. And then finally, in terms of cost, we're looking at pairing these improvements with resurfacing. And so there's, a significant amount of cost efficiency there, just given that, the streets can be torn up. So it's a good time to reimagine it and, put it back for, build it back better for a cheaper cost. And in terms of the options, option B would be slightly less expensive because it includes less signal upgrades that would be required. So that will get into the design concepts. We're gonna, like Renee mentioned, be breaking out into 2 different sessions. For the first session, we'll focus on the Makai Zone, which is Keʻeaumoku to King Street. And then for the second session, we'll be looking at King to Wilder. So for the Makai Zone, this is the existing cross section. So again, 3 lanes of traffic in each direction. The Diamond Head lane has peak hour limited parking along portions of it and 8-foot sidewalks on each side. The proposed cross section that we're putting forward is a 5-lane cross section. So 2 lanes in each direction with a center turn lane, and then adding in protected bike lanes on each side of the street. So I'm gonna change my screen here to go through the concept. Okay. So starting at the Makai end of Keʻeaumoku Street, you can see here, this is the ramp coming down out of the garage from Ala Moana. And so one thing that we know from our traffic counts is that a lot of the traffic along Keʻeaumoku Street, there's a major desire to, if you're heading Mauka bound, to make a left turn to get over to Pi'ikoi Street so you can access the freeway. And so one idea we have is to provide a left turn coming out of Ala Moana Center, so left turn onto Keʻeaumoku Street, to allow folks from Ala Moana to get over to Pi'ikoi earlier and reduce some of the pressure on the left turns further up the corridor. So we've included that left turn in both of our options. In option A, the kind of pedestrian safety priority option, we're looking at making the left turns at Keʻeaumoku to be protected only. So that would reduce the conflicts between pedestrians and left turning vehicles. And then in option B, we would maintain it as that left turn is currently where a permissive left turn is allowed. So, potentially the left turning vehicles could turn while the people are in the crosswalk, although they would still need to yield. Moving further up the corridor, just wanted to point out a major kind of difference here at Makaloa Street. So currently, left turns are allowed at Makaloa Street in both directions. However, we know that it can be a really difficult left turn to make. Let's see here. So this left turn here and here. So in option A, we're proposing that that left turn would be prohibited. So you no longer be able to make a Malka-bound left turn at Makaloa. In addition to kind of the safety issue of trying to make a left turn across multiple lanes of traffic, while also dealing with potentially bikes, there's also a traffic impact because it's so difficult to make that left. Cars can end up queuing behind the left turning vehicle, and it essentially shuts down one of the through lanes in the Malka-bound direction. So that's something that we'll want to get your feedback on when we get into our breakout groups. Another item is the right turn in the Makai-bound direction. So this is one location where we have a conflict between the bike lane on the curb and the right turn lane that's trying to access Makaloa Street. So if you're bicyclists here and you're wanting to go through, you need to, there's a potential conflict with the right turn. And so in option A, which is the kind of pedestrian and bike priority option, we would separate those movements by providing a bicycle signal at Makaloa Street. So there would be a right turn on green arrow only that would separate the right turning vehicles from the bikes. In option B, we look at having a conflict zone to allow traffic to merge across the bike lane so that they can make that right turn without conflicting with the bike lane. Moving further up the corridor, another issue that we'll want to get your feedback on is we've identified this block between Kanunu and Makaloa as potentially one of those longer blocks where there may be a desire for mid-block crossing. So we've tried to include that in option A by coupling it with a new transit island and providing a pedestrian refuge island here. It's kind of a difficult fit because of the different driveways here, but we want to get feedback from the community on whether there's a desire for that type of facility in this location. In option B, you can see that there is no mid-block crossing there, and instead of that transit island, we're looking at kind of a bus pull-in in this location. So the bus would pull out of traffic, pull over to the side, and also we know that the Walmart location is a popular stop for the handy van, and so we've provided space in both options for a handy van loading area. So here and here. As we move further up the corridor, again, there's another right turn bike lane conflict at Kanunu Street. So the option A, the bike priority option, separates that again by using a bike signal, and option B would address that by having a conflict zone to get the bike lane off of the curb to be able to go through the intersection. At Rycroft Street, in option A, the priority pedestrian option, we'd be looking at implementing a protected only left turn to again improve safety for pedestrians and reduce conflict for those turning vehicles. Option B would allow left turns in allow permissive left turns, so they could just go on the green and have to yield to oncoming traffic and pedestrians and bikes. Moving further up the corridor, we have a couple locations for potential crossings of Keʻeaumoku Street. So wanted to get input from you all tonight on where you would like to see that mid-block crossing. So one option would be to put it at Leona Street at the current intersection there, to include a median refuge island and a rapid flashing beacon to facilitate safe crossing across Keʻeaumoku. Another potential option would be to put it mid-block, kind of near HMSA or the existing McDonald's, to allow folks to get across this long block along Keʻeaumoku. And then finally, approaching King Street, again, there's another conflict between right-turning vehicles and the bike lane, so here and here. So in the bike priority option, we've separated that conflict by using a bicycle signal to separate right turns from bicycles and pedestrians. And in option B, we've used conflict zones to allow right-turning vehicles to merge across the bike lane to get into the right turn lane. So with that, that was kind of a quick overview of the concepts. We're gonna move into our breakout groups. So please save your questions and ask them in the breakout groups, and we'll be looking to get your feedback on some of these potential improvements. Okay, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so we will go into the middle and Makai zones for the next breakout session. So the middle character zone, we're kind of defining as between King and Keʻeaumoku Streets. So the current cross section is more or less a 6-lane cross section. So, you know, similar to the Makai Zone, you have 3 travel lanes in each direction, except there's no parking in this portion of the corridor, no on-street parking in this portion of the corridor. So the proposed cross section, again, is similar to that Makai portion of the corridor. We're looking at 2 through lanes in each direction with a center turn lane, and then providing protected bike lanes on each side of the street. So we'll go back again to the mirror board. And head over to the middle section. So a couple kind of primary differences I wanted to get your thoughts on. One, I think we covered previously, but at King Street, we'd be looking at separating the Makai-bound right turns from the bikes with a bike signal in option A. And in option B, we'd use conflict zone markings to get the bike lane off the curb so that right turns can make that right turn yielding to pedestrians. The area section between King and Baratania is pretty similar, except kind of one primary difference in that in option B, we wanted to explore potentially prohibiting all left turns from Keʻeaumoku onto Yonge Street. And the primary reasoning for doing this would be to provide as much queuing space as possible for Makai-bound left turns on Baratania and Makai-bound left turns onto King Street. We know that both of those movements are, you know, really heavy traffic movements during the peak hour, and so providing additional queuing space kind of allows, you know, limits the possibility that that queue is going to spill back into the through lane. In option A, we're showing maintaining the existing left turn, so there's kind of short left turn pockets onto Yonge Street in each direction. So that's something that we'll want to get your feedback on in the breakouts. So obviously, if we do prohibit it, you know, cars that would be looking to make that movement would have to reroute to get there to their destination. Moving further up the corridor, the primary difference here is that between Beretania and Keʻeaumoku Street, again, there's a conflict between Makai-bound right-turning vehicles onto Beretania and the bike lane and pedestrians crossing Beretania Street here. So in option A, we're looking again at separating those movements using a bike signal. And in option B, we'd be looking at using a conflict zone marking to get the right turning vehicles across the bike lane so that they could make that right turn where they would still need to yield to pedestrians. And then finally at Keʻeaumoku Street in option A, so that there currently is a existing kind of access lane from the underpass Keʻeaumoku that comes out at onto Keʻeaumoku Street at Keʻeaumoku, and it creates a little bit of difficulty with the bike lane and also the through traffic movement because they need to merge kind of in this space. And so to address that in option A, we're suggesting again to separate those movements using a bike signal. So we would essentially allow bikes and traffic to go from the bridge, and then when that would turn off, it would allow the underpass traffic to go onto Keʻeaumoku Street. And then in option B, to remove that conflict, we look at reversing the access road. And so that's something we want to get your input on. But essentially, instead of cars coming out the access road, they would only be able to go the opposite way, go in the access road. So obviously that would remove the conflict between the bike lane and the traffic through lane on Keʻeaumoku Street at that location. And we're also looking at potential, that would also allow us to have a curb extension on the Eva side of Keʻeaumoku Street at Keʻeaumoku. So with that, we will go into the Malka section of the corridor. So this is the area from Keʻeaumoku Street to Wilder. The cross section, the existing cross section over the H1 bridge is 2 lanes in each direction with a center left turn lane that goes to the U-turn onto Lunalilo Street. And the proposed cross section that we're looking at would go down to 1 lane in each direction and maintain that left turn onto Lunalilo Street. And then we'd be able to add protected bike facilities in each direction, not only to provide dedicated space for bikes, but also to provide that buffer from traffic for folks on the sidewalk. So going into the plan view, again, you can see here at Keʻeaumoku Street, there's a small portion where we would need to remove the bike lane protection. Basically, our traffic analysis has shown that we need to maintain these 2 Malka-bound lanes at this section, and we also need to provide kind of a left turn pocket so that left turn doesn't back up the through traffic in the Makai direction. So because we need those 4 lanes of traffic, we have to remove the bike lane protection just kind of for a short stretch at the beginning of the H1 overpass. So moving up the overpass, we would bring the bike lane protection back. There's 1 through lane in each direction with that center turn lane that turns into the U-turn at Makaloa. So under both of these, and that's the same for both of these designs. And then at Makaloa, or sorry, at Lunalilo, currently you have to left turn across 2 lanes of traffic and deal with, after you make the left turn, there's potentially pedestrians in this crosswalk here. So we've tried to organize it a bit more. Obviously now you would only need to left turn across 1 lane of traffic and still deal with the look out for pedestrians in the crosswalk. So that's the same for both alternatives. We do want to get your thoughts on kind of where a safe crossing would be in this Mauka portion of the corridor to get folks across Keʻeaumoku Street between H1 and Wilder. So there's a current underpass here that connects kind of near behind the skate park under Keʻeaumoku Street. It connects the district park to essentially Lunalilo Street. But we've heard in our consultations with stakeholders, as well as in our surveys and Wikimap, that that underpass is scary for a lot of folks. A lot of folks didn't even really know about it, and the folks that did know about it didn't really like to use it because especially at night, they thought it was kind of dangerous. And so one option would be to try to look at improvements to that existing underpass through lighting and signage and those sorts of things. Another option that we're showing in option A would be to provide a street level crosswalk near the Lunalilo U-turn. And we'd likely be looking at a raised crosswalk at that location to try to slow down traffic because it is such a long block without any signalized intersections. And then in option B, we're looking at as an alternative to install a crosswalk with a pedestrian refuge island at Kaihee Street to provide that connection to the park. So again, that's something that we'll want to get your thoughts on in the breakout groups. Adjacent to the park, we've tried to maintain as much parking as we can. We've also maintained the existing bus stop by providing transit islands here so that the bike lane would come up to sidewalk level behind the transit island. And there would be pedestrian crossing areas so that they could get out to the transit island. And then, yeah, so this is the existing intersection at Wilder. So it would maintain all of the Mauka bound movement. So a left turn through lane and a right turn. And then it would go down to, one through lane in the Makai bound direction. So that is the quick presentation of the concept. We're going to go into our breakout groups again. So please ask your facilitators questions that you might have. And yeah, we'll come back afterwards and do some more polling. Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for everyone that's participated tonight. Really appreciate your time. It's been great to get your feedback in the breakouts and really interesting to see the responses in polling as well. So just in terms of next steps, we'll be posting the video of this meeting as well as the slide deck and the proposed concepts on the project website. So if you want to go back and take a look, please do. If you please share it with your friends and family and whoever. We want to get as much input from the community as we can. But we're going to leave the public comment period open for the rest of the year. So we'll close it on December 31st. And please provide your comments to the email on the next page. It's also available at the project website. So again, following kind of the end of the comment period, we'll look at all the feedback we receive and we'll take another look at our design alternatives, select or refine and select a preferred design concept. So we'll also need to be doing some kind of additional studies to make sure that the changes that we're proposing are acceptable, and we'll be coming back and presenting that preferred design alternative to the community at a second community meeting sometime next year. We'll kind of get a date out as early as possible to give you all a heads up. But again, please share this with anybody that might be interested. and really appreciate your time tonight. I will hand it back to Renee and or John if you have any parting thoughts.
No, I just want to thank everybody for giving up your time this evening and sharing all your thoughts with us. It's super helpful as we try to narrow down the whole universe of options into one plan moving forward. So thank you, and we will be in touch. I don't know, anybody else? John or Roger?
No, again, just echoing, really thank everybody for their mana'o tonight. Sometimes doing something transformative is really difficult and really hard. And it's just important for us to hear from the people that use it every day and, how they imagine this to be, I mean, not only for now, but into the future. So really thank everybody for spending the time with us tonight.